Medical school is hard. A lot of people say it's like trying to drink water from a fire hydrant, that the massive amount of content that you will have to study will drive you to a severe caffeine addiction, and that you will have to buy hair loss treatment, shampoo, and conditioner to save what poor little follicles you have left after looking at your study schedule. So in this video, I'm going to share my extensive medical school experience of exactly 1 month to give an idea of what my medical school is like so far, my general schedule, my feelings, and my thoughts going forwards. So let's do it. If this is your first time here, my name is Frank. I am a first-year medical student at the UQ Ochsner program, where I do 2 years of preclinical studies here in Australia with the University of Queensland, and then 2 years back in the United States of clinical rotations with the Ochsner Health System. And to start things off, I just want to say that the UQ campus here is really nice. It has a unreasonable amount of cafe spots. It has like 6 different libraries, not including additional study spots like the art museum, and of course a bunch of food places to pick from, so I'm super happy about that. In addition, the public transportation here in the city in Brisbane is actually really nice. The buses have like their own roads, so it's super easy to just take the bus to school, which is not something I'm very much accustomed to back in the United States. And also, apparently, I can actually take a ferry to school, and just the fact that I can like take a boat to school is kind of just mind-blowing for me. But anyways, moving on to my schedule. So the first week of school, we actually did a bunch of introductory lectures trying to sort of dip our toes into what the material is going to look like for like the next 2 years. And then weeks 2 and 3, we did immunity and infections. And this week, we just started to do the cardiology block, which is 5 weeks long. The thing is, all of these traditional blocks, so like for example, infection, immunity, cardiology, basically it's mainly one class, and that is clinical science. We also have 3 other classes to worry about. We have ethics, we have HSR, which is health, society, and research, which at this point kind of feels like ethics 2.0, but I've been told it gets into more research material down the road. And finally, we have clinical practice, which is super important because it's a class that essentially teaches us how to communicate with patients and how to perform things like physical exams. So yeah, I mean, it's just 4 classes, but I would say clinical science takes up maybe 85, maybe even 90% of my time at this point. The analogy of trying to drink from fire hydrant is 100% true. It's very hard to keep up with the all the material being thrown at you, and especially because my friends and I are trying to study for the step 1 like ahead of time. So at the same time that we're looking at class lectures, we're also kind of taking a peek at step 1 material and trying to merge those study strategies together, so it takes up a lot of time. I still don't think that I've reached that like optimal study technique, but I do notice that I've slowly been improving over the past couple of weeks, and I guess that's all we can really hope for at this point. But yeah, it's a lot of content. I do want to say that it's very doable, and there's specific strategies that we can employ to make all of this more digestible. To give you an idea of what a typical week looks like for us, we usually have around 10 different lectures just from clinical science. So just from that one class, we have 10 lectures. In this past week for cardiology, we actually had lectures on an overview of cardiovascular anatomy, intro to cardiovascular physiology, pharmacology of the autonomic nervous system, pharmacology for hypertension, primary and secondary hypertension, clinical features of cardiovascular medicine, an overview of cardiovascular pathology, a lecture on shock recognition and the different types of shock, 3 short videos on pathology, 1 on thrombosis, embolism, and infarction. Adding on to that, we had 3 in-person practicals, and our first one was the anatomy lab. So we went to the anatomy lab, saw structures, then we had radiology, so we know what those structures look like on imaging tests, and finally we had a physiology practical, where we essentially looked at how different things can affect the blood flow of the heart. Moving on, this week I also had 3 different activities with my CBL group, or case-based learning group, and 2 of those had to do with us looking at a clinical scenario and literally just discussing our way through it with a physician mentor as a guide. And then the last meeting that we had was with our clinical coach, where we learned how to communicate with patients and take their history. Speaking of which, I think next week with our clinical coach, we're supposed to be learning how to actually start making physical exams, so that's going to be pretty exciting, I think. And then finally, the last 2 things I had to do this week was, one was go to a histology lecture, and the second one was go to an HSR, or Health, Society, and Research lecture, which were both mandatory, and so I actually had to show up instead of watching them later online at my own pace like I usually do for most of my lectures. That all sounds like a lot, and it is, but I promise you it's very, very doable. Like I said, I'm still trying to figure out the correct formula on how to actually approach things in the most effective way, but what I have been doing is trying to make a schedule for myself. I think this is super, super important, and so every Sunday, like the day before the week, I sit down and write down all the lectures that I will have for that week and try to make myself some sort of like wish list schedule to at least attempt to keep myself on track. Whether or not I stick to the wish list schedule is a different conversation, but I do think it is important to have some sort of idea on what I'm going to be doing each and every day to really stay on track. In terms of feelings, overall, I'd say like the first week was super bad. I had like an anxiety moment where I was like, oh God, like what am I doing with my life? But every week since, it's gotten just a little bit better as I've adapted to the workload and I've really figured out what works for me and what doesn't work for me anymore. The thing is, the fire hose doesn't stop. The water just keeps pouring on you. Even when you think you've caught up, all of a sudden you're far behind. And so I've had to really adapt to this feeling that I'm always going to be behind and there is always something that I could be doing, but that's okay. And then talking to other people, other friends, colleagues about this feeling of being behind, I think is the best way to combat it, because if you start asking around, everyone pretty much feels the same way. Everyone is going through the exact same thing. And so it's like a very, very interesting bonding experience that happens. The other thing is that homesickness has been a very real thing since I'm actually living in Australia. It's the first time I'm away from home and I've got all my family back in the States. But obviously what helps with this is just communicating and talking to family members, which has honestly really, really helped a lot. I also have this like digital picture frame that my brother gave me as a gift, and just seeing like my dogs and pictures of me and my family there has really helped a lot with this. Also, imposter syndrome is a very real thing, and I think this happens a lot because, well, personally, I put like a disproportionate amount of focus on my weaknesses and how I'm not as up to par as other people. But like I said before, just talking to classmates is probably the best way to get over this, because you then realize that everyone kind of has their own weakness and concerns, and just from a superficial appearance view, you might not really get that unless you really talk to other people, and then you realize that everyone's pretty much going through the same thing. It's a struggle, it's a progress, and it'll be fine. It's fine, it's all fine. Moving on a little bit, I've also been noticing that not focusing 100% of my time on medicine is the best way to study medicine. And that's because, like, if you're on the edge of burnout, it doesn't really do you any good to start reviewing even more pharmacology for hours if you're not retaining anything. Good mental health is very, very important in terms of being able to encode new information and actually learn the content. And so it doesn't really help if you're just pushing onwards, even though you might or should be taking a break at this point. And this is something I'm really keeping in mind, because my default study mode is really just like go all in on something all at once. And I remember back when I was studying for the MCAT, I was constantly on this stage of almost burnout. And it really didn't do me any good. It tanked my mental health and it made me not retain as much information as I should have. So it's something I'm really keeping in mind this time around. And thankfully, right now I have a very nice group of friends that we try to do at least one thing every single week to unwind a little bit before we go back to spamming our space bars in Anki. So the plan going forward, there's already a lot of things that I've started to change looking back at the first few weeks. Back then, I was actually taking a lot of notes, and no longer am I doing this because I found that it was not very effective for me to be taking notes. Even though I was trying to summarize things in my own words, it just wasn't really sticking. And so what I'm doing now is that I'm watching the lectures, and then every now and then I will stop and essentially verbalize to myself what just happened as if I was explaining it to a 10-year-old. And this is called the Feynman technique. It's basically the idea that if you are able to explain something to a 10-year-old, that means that you have reached a good enough level of understanding, and also by doing this, you realize the weak points that you have and what you might have to look further into. So as I'm watching the lectures, I am constantly verbalizing things back to myself as if I was explaining it to a 10-year-old. And then after doing all that, I make sure I have the appropriate flashcards in Anking, and then really it's just spaced repetition afterwards. Besides Anking and besides the class lectures, The other resources that I've been using are the Boards and Beyond lecture videos, which are extremely well done and actually link up super smoothly with OnKing. I've also been using Amboss as a reference guide, and then there's like a Google Drive with the year 2's like notes and tips and tricks on what to learn for our upcoming tests. Besides the whole like becoming more effective at studying bits, I think what I want to do moving forwards is to take more particular care of my health, like physically speaking. So like go to the gym more, because I found out that I'm actually much more productive when I'm like doing regular exercise than not. And I think this is because it just makes you feel better about yourself, like you're more accomplished just because you are going to the gym and you're taking like stress off yourself by just, you know, lifting weights. And this has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that we're currently covering the cardiovascular system, and it's terrifying to see what could actually happen to you if you don't take care of your body. In addition, generally, I do want to be making more of these videos. I do think they have a net positive outcome on my mental health, just because it gives me something else to do other than the constant daily grind of medical school. And so expect more of these in the future. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. And now I actually have to go do some monkey. So have a wonderful day. Goodbye.